what makes music sound like anything? Music in itself is typically abstract and only representative. Themes for characters and places likewise typically represent their more abstract qualities, like culture or emotion. But I'm always fascinated by music that represents more tactile, physical sensations, like temperature. Why does Lethal Lava Land sound so sweltering? Why does the Terraria ice theme got me shivering in me timbers? In this video, we're mostly going to take a look at how harmony specifically can create the sense of coldness and wintry atmosphere. I find it more interesting anyways to focus on these aspects. Otherwise, most of the time you're able to just brute force a snow level by throwing in some sleigh bells.
Ho, ho, ho! Merry Christmas!
In general, I feel like cold music in video games tends to fall into one of 4 arbitrary non-mutually exclusive categories, which I've organized in a descending order of energy and perceived temperature. The first and probably most prominent category in all types of wintry or otherwise cold music is stuff that sounds like Christmas. Of course, the dreaded aforementioned sleigh bells are present in pretty much every ice/snow/winter level which uses this sound. But I think there's a bit more depth to be explored not only in the instrumentation but the harmony and melody. One of my favorite video game tunes that unapologetically sounds like Christmas is Snowball Park from Super Mario 3D World. Let's take a listen. Right off the bat, we have some pretty interesting things. The intro features this auxiliary diminished chord. Our G major briefly goes to G diminished and then back to G. It's definitely a super old-timey kind of sound that harkens back to the jazz tradition of Christmas music. The following chord progression, 1-6-2-5, is a variation of the rhythm changes chord progression. In this particular instance, especially given some things we'll see later, this seems very evocative to the point of direct homage of the Leroy Anderson classic Sleigh Ride, which features the same chord progression. The tune continues for a bit in this same groove until we go into the B section, where strings take over the flute melody and the energy increases. That main melodic figure kicks off the B section, but the chord progression has changed to a simple 2-5-1. Something really interesting happens after these first 2 bars, however, as we briefly tonicize this E major chord. This fleeting pocket of E major is so bright coming from C major, then the next measure tonicizes a slightly warmer G major for an even shorter amount of time, before bringing us right back around to C major land. These fast mini key changes feel super fitting of a Christmas song B section, and actually almost the exact same thing happens in Sleigh Ride. Our chord progression changes to 2-5-1 just like what we have here in Snowball Park. The only difference is that we immediately start the B section in E major, and then rather than going up to G major, go up to D major instead. I think this category of winter music is unique in the sense that the association with coldness has an additional degree of separation compared to the others. Rather than being a direct abstraction of the concept of coldness, it's a pastiche of traditional Western Christmas music, whose sound was shaped by jazz sensibilities of the 40s and 50s. In fact, despite the connection to the physical coldness of winter, this kind of sound is actually quite cheerful and major, feeling emotionally warm. I find these kinds of video game tunes interesting because they typically strip the identifying Christmassy vocals and typically don't feature any overtly Christmassy iconography within the levels. And yet this association is still strong enough with just instrumentation and chord progression that the music immediately reads as wintry versus just orchestral jazz. I suppose that's just the strength of such an enduring cultural tradition. This track plays during most of the snowy levels in Super Mario 3D World. Apart from the previously mentioned cold associations, it works really well as a Christmas music imitation because of the similarity in energy. The childlike frivolity of Christmas music matches the fast, jumpy, platforming gameplay perfectly, which is why, anecdotally at least, wintry Mario music typically adheres to this kind of sound. But there's also the category of tunes that feel wintry and still positive and major without sounding like Christmas. I feel like these tunes lean more into the physical properties of winter, attempting to evoke snow and ice. A tune that captures this bright, wintry feeling perfectly is Snowy from Undertale. Compared to the previous tune, the instrumentation is much simpler. It's literally just solo piano, at least until the violin-flute duet later. The harmony is also a lot simpler. The harmonic rhythm and the tempo in general have slowed, where we now have one chord per bar, a simple C major 9 to B minor 9, or in Roman numerals 4 to 3. But there's a bit more to it. The third is omitted in both chords, lending a kind of smaller, quainter quality. And something else is happening with the 3 chord. The 3 minor 9 gives us the non-diatonic C sharp in our melody, this immediate burst of brightness. Considering our key signature of G major, the C sharp gives a sort of Lydian sound, which makes sense considering how bright and shimmery the mode can be. This, combined with the plinky, staccato style and long reverb, is so evocative of the more physical, tactile attributes of winter, like the lightness of falling snow or the fragility of ice. Compared to the first category, this tune and others like it tend to still be bright, but more serene, peaceful, and contemplative, with slower harmonic movement and less unambiguously functional harmony. Snowy plays when you're walking around the snowed-in forest. It's very fitting. I think the fact that it's not borrowing anything from the familiar Christmas sound adds to the immersion. Though you're in this tranquil, snowy forest, you're still in the greater setting of the underground, a place both unfamiliar and occasionally hostile. It's very possible Toby's usage of this specific chord progression in a wintry setting was inspired by Final Fantasy VII's Buried in the Snow, which plays during the Great Glacier section of the game. The chords, harmonic rhythm, and even key signature are pretty much exactly the same, with the only big differences being the waltzier 3/4 and less overt melody. Perhaps the 3/4 is arguably more wintry, but otherwise there's nothing really new to talk about when it comes to this tune. But I think it shows the strength of this minimal chord progression, appearing in 2 iconic winter areas from 2 iconic games. It's absolutely possible that the similarity between these 2 tracks is a coincidence, which is actually even cooler. All of the tunes in Category 3 fall under what I would call abstract winter, evoking the more conceptual, non-Christmas qualities of winter, such as stasis, stillness, and isolation. Tunes in this category are typically used in more hostile winter environments, such as our first and probably one of the most iconic examples in a Nintendo game, Phendrana Drifts from Metroid Prime. Once again, our harmonic rhythm has slowed, to the point where we now only have just one chord that loops indefinitely. Over this synthy C drone, we have this shimmery piano playing these ambiguous voicings. If we're assuming C as our root, which later parts of the tune confirm, then both hands vaguely outline this C minor-ish kind of flavor. But the vertical slices are really interesting because even though the right hand does give us our expected chord tones of E flat and G, the left hand avoids them entirely. We never really get that satisfying sense of C minor, it kind of just washes through these mildly unresolved flavors. Even when the voice comes in, it still leans into this more ambiguous sound, starting the melody on F before meandering its way down to C. It's definitely not super dark. The piano and voice kind of capture the beauty of the still, snowy scenery of the Phendrana Drifts. Though the melody does outline a vague C minor sound, it's not oppressively minor because it keeps the voicings ambiguous. This tonality just loops almost indefinitely, and that kind of stagnation combined with the solo voice just feels so lonely. And the sweeping synth drone creates this subtle, sinister undertone, reminding you of the dangers lurking deeper in the snow. Though kind of different games and settings, this tune reminds me a lot of Freeze Flame Galaxy from Super Mario Galaxy. Listen to this tune's similar, unchanging ostinato. We have two main elements to the harmony, the ostinato, which outlines the root, flat 7th, and 5th of the chord, and the jumpier synth that plays on the start of each bar. Just like in Vendrana Drifts, the harmony doesn't really give us a clean outline of a chord. Taking all of the notes across the two parts gives us a D7 sus4, very similar to what happens in Metroid, and also lending an uncertain quality to the tune. There's not much for our ears to latch onto, which I feel gives a perfect sense of isolation and perhaps even uneasiness. The melody comes in with this pretty simple figure, still not giving us our third, and mostly repeating notes seen in our harmonic parts. I love what happens in the second phrase though. Everything is exactly the same except for one note. Our E in the melody changes to E flat, changing our perceived minor-ish sound to a darker, Phrygian quality. It's just so efficient in darkening the entire tune. One through line with all of our ice themes thus far has been this higher register, and generally higher pitched instruments, effects, or EQ. Things like sleigh bells, glockenspiel, and the higher register of a piano to me seem to evoke the glistening of ice and snow and light. Or perhaps even the density of ice, the tightness in the air. This tune is no different. And it's cool because even though pretty much all of the instruments are synthetic, they capture that shimmery higher register and delay or reverb that we typically associate with ice. Which is why I love that juxtaposition of that darker E flat. It doesn't sacrifice the shivery strain of this higher octave, but relative to our earlier E still feels so foreboding, like a snowstorm slowly increasing in intensity. Which brings us to what I consider the last category of wintry ice music. The lowest possible energy and the darkest emotionally. Not necessarily sinister, but the most empty and devoid of emotional warmth. One honorable mention is the Cold Temperatures theme from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. It has all of the qualities of coldness we've seen thus far, but more sparse in pretty much every aspect. There's no meter or time feel, no tonality, just these emotionless, long, reverby howls, and occasional piercing percussive stabs underneath. It feels like a direct imitation of nature itself, the chords sounding like the bitter coldness of an icy wind in an uninhabitable climate. But honestly, my favorite video game ice theme is actually from a different Zelda game, the Ice Caverns theme from Ocarina of Time. What I love about this theme is just how boldly it approaches the feeling of ice. It's the most minimal of anything we've seen thus far, just this bright bell kind of synth. The rolled chords are sparse and pretty much untimed, seemingly played at random intervals. And the harmony is so interesting in how deceptively simple it is. Our first chord is C, E, A, D, technically a C6-9 chord. But what really stands out to me is the quartal voicing of those top three notes. We rarely see these kinds of voicings in general, and on top of that, we're actually just moving this exact chord and voicing around in constant structure. Specifically, we're taking our chord shape and moving it down in whole steps. Throughout the tune, we meander our way downwards, the lowest point being the G-flat 3 whole steps down from our starting point. Walking that C down by that much produces a kind of whole tone scale sound. But since we're moving the entire chord down through the whole tone scale, it's even more wild. It's such an idiosyncratic, dream-like sound that I can't say I've really heard in many other places. And I think the way it approaches this darkness is so cool. Even though the chords are technically major-ish, the chordal voicings are so striking that it kind of rips you out of any sense of major. And going down in whole steps not only destroys any sense of tonality or key center, but also moves counterclockwise on the circle of fifths, bringing us into flatland. Relative to our starting point of C, it gets progressively darker. All of this comes together to create just this elegant, almost alien sound. This realm of suspended animation feels impossibly frigid, and entirely lacking in any sense of humanity. It's the most quintessentially cold music I've ever heard in a game, and in my opinion, the perfect ice level theme. But what do you guys think? There are a bunch of other banger ice, snow, and winter themes I didn't even talk about, so post your favorite in the comments. The temperature do be dropping, and I'll probably make a wintry playlist with all of your guys' suggestions and listen to it when I'm cranking the AC because it's still 80 degrees in LA.